The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education. Connect to a world of learning.
There was no day off for thousands of workers in Rome, New York on July 4th, 1817. Instead, they celebrated Independence Day by rolling up their sleeves, picking up shovels, and swinging pickaxes. With only manpower and horsepower, they began digging their way across the state to build the longest canal yet to exist in America or Europe. Finally, in October 1825, the Erie Canal was complete, changing the landscape of New York State forever. In 1800, the western frontier of the United States was at the Appalachian Mountains. But settlers and traders wanted to push farther west into the fertile farmlands of the Northwest Territory, present-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And New York City was in fierce competition with other East Coast ports to control the trade in crops, furs, and other resources from the West. To get to the Northwest Territory in the early 1800s, settlers and traders had to travel along dirt roads. The journey could take weeks. And in winter, rain and snow turned the trails into rivers of mud. A new and faster transportation route was needed. Ships had always been able to travel the Hudson River between New York City and Albany in upstate New York. But what if Albany could be linked to Lake Erie and to the resources of the West with a canal? A canal is a man-made waterway used to connect bodies of water. In 1817, New York Governor DeWitt Clinton appeared before the state legislature. His goal was to persuade lawmakers to grant $7 million for the construction of a canal. It would be 363 miles long, 40 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. And it would link the Hudson River in the east to Lake Erie in the west. Some people made fun of the governor's project, calling it Clinton's Ditch. They didn't think such a long canal could ever be built, but they were wrong. Workers on the Erie Canal were local laborers and immigrants from Ireland. They were paid $8 to $12 a month, or 50 cents a day. They didn't have any special training and often had to learn on the job, under difficult conditions. They had to blast through solid rock, dig through swamps infested with mosquitoes and snakes, and clear trees and stumps from the canal's path. Many bridges had to be built over the canal so that existing roads would remain connected. Most importantly, the water in a canal has to be level so boats can navigate it. But New York State is not flat. Lake Erie is more than 500 feet higher in elevation than the Hudson River. Engineers in Europe had solved this problem by building locks to raise and lower boats from one water level to another. So that's what workers on the Erie Canal project did. When a boat reaches a lock, a section of the canal is closed off with gates or doors so that water can be removed or added through tunnels called sluices. When the water level matches up, the boat can continue to travel on. The Erie Canal officially opened in October 1825 when Governor Clinton and other state officials boarded a boat called the Seneca Chief in Buffalo. They traveled for 10 days on the canal, finally arriving in Albany on the Hudson River. Towns along the canal held parties and parades, and people came out to cheer. In New York City, there was a huge celebration called the Wedding of the Waters, where Governor Clinton poured a barrel of water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic Ocean to show that the two major bodies of water were now linked. The Erie Canal changed the lives of people in New York almost instantly. People and goods could move across the state faster and cheaper. In the first year it was open, 2,000 boats, 9,000 horses, and 8,000 men traveled along the canal, transporting goods from place to place. Farmers and ranchers in the Northwest Territory sent wheat, beef, and lumber to eastern markets. In return, they received manufactured goods such as tools, furniture, and clothing. New York City became the busiest port in the United States, as well as the nation's commercial and financial center. And its population boomed, rising from about 123,000 in 1820 to about 515,000 in 1850. Towns also sprung up along the canal as trade increased and industry grew. Just look at New York State today to see the Erie Canal's influence. Every major city except for two falls along the trade route from New York City to Albany, through Schenectady, Utica, and Syracuse to Rochester and Buffalo. Nearly 80% of upstate New York's population lives within 25 miles of the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal changed the course of American history as well. It was the first major transportation system to open up the western frontier to settlers. The Transcontinental Railroad and the interstate highway system came later. Thoughts and ideas also traveled more quickly throughout the country. Supporters of women's rights and abolitionists who wanted to end slavery set up offices along the Erie Canal so their ideas would be heard by many and then spread far and wide. With the invention of large cargo ships, trucks, and airplanes, the Erie Canal is no longer used as a major trade route, but it is still a popular recreational spot for boaters and vacationers. The Erie Canal helped make America what it is today, and its importance is preserved in history, folklore, and song.
I don't have to call when I want myself. 15 years on the Erie Canal. He drops from a stall like a good old gal. 15 years on the Erie Canal. Low bridge, everybody down. Low bridge, you got the finest deal in town.
The United States has long been a destination for immigrants from around the world. Immigrants are people who leave one country to settle in another. And New York City has a rich tradition of welcoming people from other lands. Ellis Island and Castle Garden were usually the first stops for immigrants coming from Europe and other distant regions. The first major wave of immigration started in 1815, after a long series of wars ended in Europe. Millions of people, most of them from Germany, Great Britain, and Ireland, came to New York eager to escape their unstable homelands. Another wave of immigration took place in the late 1840s as a result of the Irish potato famine. A famine is a drastic and wide-reaching food shortage. Potatoes were the primary food source for most of the Irish population. But in the 1840s, a disease spread across the country, causing potato plants to turn black and rot. The famine lasted for 5 years, from 1845 through 1849. During this period, approximately 1 million Irish died of starvation and disease. And nearly 1 million came to America to begin new lives. For decades after the famine, Irish Americans would tell stories of starving women and children whose mouths were green from eating grass. Life for many of these new Americans would be considerably better in New York. Soon, immigrants from Norway and Sweden began to arrive. And Chinese immigrants also came to the U.S. in great numbers. A second major wave of immigration to New York began around 1880, and the people came from Eastern and Southern Europe. Seeking economic opportunity, large numbers of Italians, Poles, and Hungarians came to the United States. And Eastern European Jews came in search of religious freedom. Between 1880 and 1920, 4.1 million Italians entered the U.S., and the Italian population in New York exploded, with more than 2,000 community organizations in New York City alone. The population of Eastern European Jews also grew at an amazing rate. They were more likely to stay in the U.S. than other groups. By 1920, half of the Jewish population in the U.S. lived in New York City. Most immigrants had similar experiences during their journey to the U.S. They traveled by ship. The poorer passengers spent the journey in steerage, a section near the bottom of the ship that provided the cheapest accommodations. They endured cramped quarters and weeks of seasickness while crossing rough Atlantic waters. Upon arrival, steerage and third-class passengers were sent to the immigration stations Castle Garden or Ellis Island. Here, they underwent a medical exam and legal inspection. Those who had contagious diseases or legal problems were sent back to their homelands. About 2% of immigrants were excluded for these reasons. But most immigrants were allowed to enter the U.S. to begin their new lives and face a new set of obstacles and hardships. Many thought they had left behind prejudice and discrimination, only to experience it again in the U.S. Irish were frequently singled out because they were Catholic. In 1831, Protestants set St. Mary's Catholic Church in New York City on fire. Discrimination against the Chinese was even more common, largely due to U.S. government policies. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act made it illegal for Chinese immigrants to enter the country, and those already in the U.S. were not eligible for citizenship. The law stopped the growth of the Chinese community in New York. Employment was also a problem. Greedy factory owners often took advantage of the immigrants' poverty and poor language skills to get cheap labor. Often men, women, and children would work long hours in sweatshops or factories with low wages and dangerous and dirty working conditions. Children were especially at risk. Child labor was usually the result of kidnapping or an arrangement with desperately poor parents. Sometimes children were sent out as beggars, roaming the streets of New York City. The living conditions for many immigrants were equally horrifying. All too often, crowded slums were the only housing a family could afford. These tenements were known for their crowded and dirty conditions. And violence was common. The Five Points area of New York City was notorious for the large number of gangs and frequent riots. But the immigrant experience is not just about hardship and discrimination. Many established new, successful lives here. Immigrants have been coming to New York for centuries, and they continue to arrive every day. Ever since people learned to harness electricity, it has been a necessary resource in our daily lives. But before electricity, life was very different. Most work and leisure took place during daylight hours. Even in big cities like New York, work stopped when the sun went down. When electricity became widely available, it changed everything. And the person responsible for this change was Thomas Alva Edison. He is credited with ushering in the age of electricity, among other things. To this day, Edison's name is associated with invention and innovation. Edison was born in 1847 in Milan, Ohio. As a child, he was an enthusiastic student of science, often conducting experiments at home. Sometimes his experiments didn't have the best outcomes. Once, when he was experimenting with fire, Edison accidentally burned down his family's barn. In another experiment, he convinced a friend to consume large amounts of seidlitz powder, which creates gas in the stomach. He told the boy he would be able to fly. The boy did not fly, and the experiment only resulted in severe stomach pains for his friend and a stern lecture for Edison. But Edison's scientific curiosity never faded. In 1859, he persuaded his parents to let him take a job with the Grand Trunk Railroad as a candy and newspaper vendor. He soon set up a chemistry lab and printing press in a train car. He was only 12 years old. Edison's chemistry lab soon came to an end when a bottle of phosphorus fell and ignited a fire. The train conductor struck Edison's ear, and some experts believe this may have caused the deafness he experienced throughout his life. Edison's love of experimentation and sense of adventure eventually paid off. When he was 21, he perfected his first invention. It was an electric vote counter intended to be used in elections. A year later, in 1869, Edison invented the universal stock ticker. His employer paid him $40,000 for the machine, a huge sum of money. Soon after, Edison became a full-time inventor and set up a lab in Newark, New Jersey. A flood of inventions quickly followed. Among them, the electric pen and the first phonograph. Edison also made many improvements on technologies that already existed. He came to be known as the Wizard of Menlo Park, where his lab was located in New Jersey. But Edison had even bigger plans in mind. He wanted to bring electricity to New York City. He mapped out a small area in downtown Manhattan to be the first district wired for electricity. There was only one problem. He hadn't invented the light bulb yet. But this problem was soon solved. On New Year's Eve, 1879, Edison held a demonstration of his creation at the Menlo Park lab. On a stormy winter night, 3,000 onlookers watched in amazement as the factory and street nearby became aglow with light. After the stunned crowds finally left, Edison and his crew celebrated. Edison had to invent not only the light bulb, but also a system to generate and deliver electricity. So work soon began on a central power station. On September 4th, 1882, the Pearl Street Power Station opened. It was the nation's first commercial power station. Within a few months, the station was lighting more than 3,000 lamps for more than 200 customers. A year later, the figures climbed to more than 10,000 lamps and about 400 customers. The Wizard of Menlo Park had done it. He had taken electric light out of the laboratory and made it available to businesses and individual customers. This innovation transformed New York City and the world. Before Edison's light bulb, most people lit their homes and offices with gas-burning lamps. These lamps provided only a soft, flickering glow and could be dangerous because the gas was flammable and poisonous. The only type of electric lighting available before 1879 was the arc light. They lit some city streets, but were far too powerful for homes and businesses. The incandescent bulb provided a light source that was safe, efficient, and long-lasting. Over the years, Edison's innovation would influence major changes in business, industry, and transportation. People gained control over light in homes and offices. Instead of rising with the sun and ending the day when it set, people could set their own hours. This meant more flexibility with home and office activities, and greater productivity in the workplace, because employees could work longer hours. Supplying electricity to homes and offices meant a network of wires, switches, and outlets that made it fairly easy to add appliances and other machines. This would have a huge effect on the manufacturing industry. Manufacturing exploded with the increased demand for home and office appliances, and the use of electrical machines in factories allowed for faster, more efficient production flow. Mass transit systems also started to use electric power. Electric streetcars and subways changed the nature of the workday in New York and other cities, allowing people to get to and from jobs much more quickly. Edison went on to invent other devices, including the kinetoscope, the first movie viewer. But none of his inventions changed people's lives as much as his incandescent light bulb and the creation of a central power station. Thomas Edison died in 1931 with 1,093 inventions to his name. His legacy remains with us to this day and still shapes our lives.
You might not realize it, but government and laws play an important role in your daily life. Many laws exist for your protection and safety. But it hasn't always been that way. The machine age of the late 19th century gave rise to a new type of workforce as more and more people found jobs in manufacturing. But there were few laws protecting these factory workers, and the federal government paid little attention to the affairs of big business. As a result, factories across the country had a lot of power over their workers. Factory managers would often put workers at risk just to save money. Unfortunately, cutting corners to increase profits sometimes led to horrible tragedies. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a sweatshop located in New York City. Sweatshops were factories where the wages were low, the hours were long, and the jobs were dangerous and dirty. They frequently employed young women and children to produce goods quickly and cheaply. Many sweatshop workers were immigrants, people who had recently arrived in the United States seeking a better life. Because immigrants were eager to earn a living, factories could easily take advantage of these new Americans. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory employed about 500 people. Most of them were Italian and Jewish immigrant women. Some were as young as 15. They earned about $6 to $10 per week, working 14-hour days sewing clothes. The company occupied the top floors of the Ash Building in New York City's Garment District. When fire broke out on March 25, 1911, it was near closing time, and workers were getting ready to head home. But on the 8th floor, something went terribly wrong. A waste bin of cotton scraps caught fire, most likely from a match or a cigarette butt that had not been fully extinguished. The small fire quickly became a furious blaze. Most of the workers on the 8th and 10th floors were able to escape. But the 9th floor had only 2 exit doors. One door was designed to allow only one worker at a time to exit. The other was locked because the factory owners were afraid that workers might steal. The locked door would prove to be the difference between life and death for the 9th floor workers. They tried to use the building's one fire escape, but it was not designed to hold the weight of more than a few people, and it quickly collapsed from the strain. Those remaining in the building were left with few escape options: brave the flames or drop 100 feet to the pavement. More than 50 workers chose to jump. Horrified onlookers watched as workers fell to their deaths. The remaining workers either barely escaped or perished in the flames. Engine Company 72, the closest fire station, was one of the first on the scene. Other companies also sent wagons rushing to the 4-alarm blaze. Though New York City was famous for having the best firefighting gear in the world, the firemen were unable to extinguish the blaze. The 8th and 9th floors were consumed by flames. By the time the fire had run its course, 146 Triangle employees had died, most of them young women and girls. The death toll was so high that the police established a temporary morgue on the 26th Street Pier. Family members waited in line for hours to try to identify the bodies of their loved ones. The nation and world reacted to the fire with outrage. Though the fire was horrific, it brought about action from the public and some positive results. Frances Perkins, a teacher and a labor reform supporter, witnessed workers jumping to their deaths. It was an event that changed her life. Perkins helped get laws passed to improve worker safety. She became Secretary of Labor in 1933 under President Roosevelt, the first woman cabinet member in U.S. history. Many scholars consider the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and its aftermath to be the beginning of significant change in the laws protecting workers. Today, American factory workers are much safer as a result. But the Triangle Fire still serves as an extreme example of what can happen when those laws do not exist. When the Dutch founded Harlem in 1658, it was a sleepy little town. But a century later, its rolling hills were dotted with the estates of wealthy farmers and merchants. Harlem was rural, and the population was mostly white. Things have changed a lot since then. Today, Harlem is a very diverse section of New York City. The neighborhood has a rich blend of different types of music, food, art, dance, and literature. But most of all, it's known as a place with a rich African-American heritage. And one period in history is responsible for giving us that impression: the Harlem Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth. It usually refers to a period of energetic artistic and intellectual activity. The Harlem Renaissance celebrated the unique culture of African Americans. It began in 1919 and continued into the early 1940s. One cause of the Harlem Renaissance was a mass movement of African Americans from the South to the North. Many factors pulled people from the South. Higher wages, greater educational opportunities, and the hope of escaping racism were only a few. Jobs were another. World War I and immigration reform in the 1920s slowed the flow of immigrants from Europe. This opened up a huge number of jobs in the industrial North to African Americans, especially in New York City. But the roots of the Harlem Renaissance reach back even further. In 1904, the Lenox Avenue subway stop was completed. This made traveling to and from Harlem faster and easier. Soon after, the price of homes in the neighborhood dropped, and Harlem became an affordable place for African Americans to live. Many were able to buy homes for the first time. Harlem grew into a tight-knit community made up of African Americans from the South, Black immigrants from the West Indies, and native New Yorkers. The stage was set for a flood of Black artistic and literary works. The artists and writers of the Harlem Renaissance used different styles and subject matter, but their work shared common themes. Two themes were hope and pride. The Great Migration and the promise of opportunity in the North had given Black Americans more control over their lives than ever before. promoting a sense of pride and hope for the future. But an even stronger theme was disappointment. African Americans saw a gap between their lives and the freedom and opportunity they had been promised. Though Harlem was not the South, discrimination, poverty, and violence still existed. Anger and confusion over these issues is expressed in different ways in the words of African American writers. Claude McKay, who was born in Jamaica, was one of the great poets of the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem residents from the West Indies were generally more aggressive about the issue of race, and this showed in McKay's forceful writing style. Responding to a nationwide outbreak of violence against African Americans, McKay declared in one poem,
"If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die."
Langston Hughes had a more emotional style. His joyful spirit can be felt in many of his works, including this section of his famous poem, Dream Variations.
To fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, dance, whirl, whirl till the quick day is done. Rest at pale evening, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me.
But the Renaissance was not limited to male writers. Zora Neale Hurston influenced Black writers for generations to come. Hurston's love of rural folk culture set her apart from other artists of the period. She traveled throughout the rural United States and to the Caribbean, where she studied folktales in Haiti and Jamaica. Her subject matter can be seen in photos from a 1935 trip she made to her southern hometown of Eatonville, Florida. The Harlem Renaissance also included music. Ragtime, jazz, and Broadway musicians transformed music during this time period. And African American painters and sculptors emerged with their own unique styles. Like most movements, the Harlem Renaissance spread throughout the country. Poetry circles formed in cities such as Houston, Texas, and Detroit, Michigan. And small theaters emerged in Los Angeles, California, and Chicago, Illinois. But eventually, it came to an end. The Great Depression contributed to its decline in the mid-1930s. Writers and artists had a difficult time selling their work in a nation paralyzed by poverty and unemployment. Despite this, the Harlem Renaissance had a lasting impact, not just on African American culture, but on American culture as a whole.